Thank you, Stacy. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone from Arlington, Virginia, and welcome to ERPi's inaugural Spark a Conversation panel, The Future of Sexual Assault Prevention and Response. My name is Eliza Spencer, and I have the honor of hosting today's panel and introducing our moderators. Spark a Conversation is a discussion series focused on convening industry experts to discuss today's important issues. Today, we will hear from experts about the current state and the future of the field. While today's discussion is focused on the future of sexual assault prevention, we recognize that our panelists may use examples or phrases that could be triggering to some in our audience. If you experience such an event, we encourage you to reach out to the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline, and we will post their phone number in the chat shortly. Before we begin, we'd like to get to know our audience a little bit. This is our first panel, and we would like to know who is joining us today. If you feel comfortable in the chat box, please share where you are calling in from and anything else that you'd like to share. If you are actively involved in sexual assault prevention and response, either in programming or organizations, feel free to put in the chat a link to your organization or any other shout outs. A few housekeeping items. Today, everyone in the audience is muted, but we do encourage you to send any questions that you may have for the panel in the chat box, and if time allows, we'll address those. We are recording this panel, and this recording will be available on ERPi's website as well as our social media about a week from today. If you have any questions or suggestions for future panels, reach out to me, and my email is on the slide right here. A word about language today. Panelists may use sexual assault and sexual violence interchangeably, and there may be some language that is specific to their programs. And before I introduce our moderators, we wanted to provide some context about the spectrum of sexual assault, which is detailed here in the continuum of harm diagram. It's important to note that sexual assault and sexual harassment cover a wide range of events, including, but not limited to, rape. I am proud to introduce today's moderators, Melissa Bartnick and Michael Hudson. Melissa Bartnick is a specialist at ERPi and a licensed clinical social worker with over a decade of experience providing direct clinical intervention. Her focus has been primarily on response efforts, specifically as an emergency department social worker, and she has continued this work by providing long-term therapy to survivors of sexual assault, both civilian and military. Melissa recently was part of a team that supported the Department of Defense's Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office in developing leadership tools and a training curriculum for prevention personnel. Michael Hudson retired in October 2014 as a colonel after 30 years as a United States Marine Corps aviator. Mike was hand-selected by the Commandant of the Marine Corps to reset the U.S. Marine Corps Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program, and to work closely with the larger behavioral health and suicide prevention teams. In 2 years, he and his team took the Marine Corps from the lowest of the services in terms of sexual assaults to the best program in DoD. Currently, Michael is the Vice President of Government Services for ClearForce and supports a nonprofit organization focused on helping veterans and their families. And with that, I will hand off the microphone to Melissa and Mike to introduce our panelists and begin our discussion. Melissa, Mike?
Great, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think ERPi as well as a thought leader in this space, so that's a really important conversation. And really to get that conversation started, it's my pleasure to introduce two of the panelists. First, I'd like to start with Jill Longergren. Jill assumed duties as the Director of Sexual Harassment Assault Prevention Program for the Department of the Army in September of last year. Previous to this assignment, she served as the Program Director for substance use disorder clinic care and the suicide risk management at the Office of the Surgeon General, and served as the Behavioral Health Red Team. Also in 2020, she was awarded the Order of Military Medical Merit for significant accomplishments supporting the Army Medical Department. Before joining as a subject matter expert in the sapper field, Jill started her journey of service by enlisting in the United States Army as a combat medic. After high school, Jill spent 6 years with the 37th Engineer Battalion at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and deployed in 2003 and 2004 in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Her awards and decorations include the Parachute Badge, Army Commendation Medal, and numerous other awards and decorations. Jill has a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and a Master's degree in Marriage and Family with a specialty in military sexual trauma. Jill, look forward to having your comments, and then welcome to the board today. It's also my pleasure to introduce Renee Fernante. Renee joined the Peace Corps headquarters staff in October of 2019 as the Sexual Assault Risk Reduction and Response Director. Previously, Renee served as the Sexual Assault Prevention Response and Program for the Defense Logistics Agency. She began her Department of Defense career with the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response, or the SAPR program, in 2006, working as a victim advocate and then as a Sexual Assault Response Coordinator, or SARC. She also served at several Army installations and finished up working as the Department of the Army SAPR program headquarters as the senior SARC. After that, she took an unusual posting to spend a year in Djibouti, establishing the United States Navy SAPR program at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, Africa. From 2011 to 2015, Renee was dual-hatted as the headquarters Marine Corps, serving as the program and specialty for the SAPR program and a SAPR subject matter expert on the Marine Corps Inspector General team. In this position, she had an active role coordinating with congressional staff, implementing the NDDA statutory requirements and Marine Corps policy, and inspecting the SAPR program at all levels of command. This is when I had a first opportunity to meet Renee, as we both supported the Marine Corps efforts to reduce sexual assault and increase reporting. Renee has a Bachelor of Arts degree in social science and a Master's of Science degree in psychology. She's a recognized subject matter expert who has testified to federal court and law enforcement. Renee, it's good to have you on the panel and good to be working with you again. I'll turn it over to Melissa real quick.
Thanks, Mike. So I have the pleasure of introducing two women that I've had the pleasure of working alongside. First one is Karen Lang. Karen Lang has over 20 years of experience working in the field of sexual violence response and prevention. She spent more than 13 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, designing innovative capacity building approaches that increase the capacity of states to plan, implement, and evaluate sexual violence prevention programs. Karen served as a sexual violence prevention SME and was the lead project officer for CDC's National Rape Prevention and Education Program. She's acted as a leader in changing state and local prevention practices, from addressing individual behavior to changing social norms, instituting policies, and engendering community involvement to prevent violence before it occurs. So welcome, Karen. Our next panelist, the final panelist, is Dr. Jill Dunlap, and she is the Senior Director for Research Policy and Civic Engagement at NASPA Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, which is based in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining NASPA, Jill worked closely with college student survivors of interpersonal violence in a professional capacity for more than 14 years at 3 different campuses. In 2014, Jill served as the non-federal negotiator representing 4-year public institutions on the Violence Against Women Act negotiated rulemaking committee. Jill's also served as a program reviewer for the Center for Disease Control, National Center for Injury Prevention, and controls research grants for preventing violence and violence-related injury. Jill is currently a political science instructor at St. Xavier University and DePaul University in Chicago. She completed her PhD in political science and public administration at Northern Illinois University, where her dissertation work focused on the experiences of students impacted by sexual violence on campus. Jill has served as a national consultant with a range of organizations, including the Victims' Rights Law Center, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and the Department of Defense. Now that we have a brief bio of all of our panelists, we wanted to give them a few minutes to tell us a little bit more about themselves and answer one question, which is, how has COVID impacted sexual assault prevention and response in your organization? And Dr. Jill Dunlap, I hope you don't mind if we start with you.
Not at all. Thank you so much. I just realized that that bio was obnoxiously long, so I don't really have anything else to introduce myself with other than I've worked in this field for a long time, and I'm really excited to be part of this panel today and to learn from the other panelists. We had a conversation yesterday where we were just sort of meeting to talk through what we were going to cover today, and I learned so much just in that conversation that I hope you all will learn alongside me today. I think in terms of COVID-19 that there have been a couple, like it sort of served as a double whammy for college campuses, mostly because it came, there was the pandemic, which made a lot of campuses go entirely virtual last spring. And then like sort of right in the middle of that, the Department of Education released its new Title IX regulations. And so that drastically changed the way that institutions were required to handle sexual assault reports in order to be in compliance with Title IX regulations coming out of the Department of Education. And so I think when I think about, I don't know that there is good data that exists right now on how COVID-19 and students going entirely virtual in many instances in terms of their online classes has impacted reporting. I was just talking with a colleague before this session. I was like, we should really look into that, right? Like, what are the numbers looking like from college campuses, given that everyone or a lot of campuses have gone entirely virtual? I do want to just say that I think that in addition to the fact that the new Title IX regulations prevent institutions from investigating instances of sexual violence and domestic violence and dating violence that happen off campus under the new regulations, that it doesn't mean that, if reporting has gone down, it is both an indication that students may not want to come forward and report in a virtual environment. Like, can you imagine sitting on a Zoom call with someone, an advocate, even if your campus has one, and reporting something really horrible that happened to you through a video screen, right? Like, I think that presents its own unique set of challenges. But in addition, the message that was sent to students under the new Title IX regulations was like, well, if it didn't happen on campus property, you're kind of out of luck. And so I think you will probably see some students who are more hesitant to report because they don't know if if the harm that has come to them, is counted under Title IX. So I think if I were to look at current trends, I would say probably reporting is likely down. But I also really want to emphasize that that doesn't mean that sexual harm and dating violence and stalking isn't happening to students. In a lot of cases, campuses are finding that even though the institution went entirely virtual, students were like, I kind of still want my social circle, so I've already signed a lease near campus, so I'm gonna move back to that community anyway. So students in many cases, even if their classes are entirely virtual since last spring, may be living in and among their peers in Greek houses that aren't campus owned, or apartments that are campus adjacent. And so they may be coming into contact in those same sort of social circles that represent areas of risk for a lot of sexual assaults that happen typically in a campus environment. And so just because they aren't being reported doesn't mean that they're not happening. And so I do wonder if what we'll see when campuses come back, if fully in person, if we'll see a lot of reports that come forward of things that have happened during this entirely virtual time. So that's sort of my thoughts on the current state of what it looks like on our college campus. And I know there's a lot of campus folks on the call today, so they can chime in as well in the chat.
Thanks, Jill. I'm sure we have lots of follow-up questions that we can get into once we start the discussion, because I feel like there's a lot of food for thought there. Karen, do you want to go next and give a short bio and then just talk about the impact that you think COVID is having on sexual assault prevention response?
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. So like Jill, I think my bio was sort of covered. I've worked in the field for over 20 years at a local level, at a rape crisis center in Detroit, had a domestic violence program in Detroit, at a state coalition, and then with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention with the Rape Prevention Education Program. I started that in 2001, and we were really able to help facilitate a sea change in the field to move away from more awareness approaches to prevention to a public health approach in primary prevention. And in 2012, the ERPi program, and some of you may be funded by ERPi on here. ERPi program was identified as one of the top 20 violence and injury prevention innovations since 1992, which was a nice honor for all the work that CDC did with community and really moving that forward. And most recently had a chance to work with Eliza and Jill Dunlap and Melissa on some work with DoD SAPRO and developing a training curriculum for new prevention professionals in the military, which was a new arena for me and really great to work in. So that was a wonderful experience. I think, when I think about sexual assault prevention and response in this current environment, I think anytime you have something, you have some major event happening, women and children who were already vulnerable are more vulnerable. And so I think we see that with sexual violence now. So, women and children who had vulnerabilities for a variety of things, maybe they had insecure housing, they were living with an abusive partner, those sort of things are just heightening vulnerability. Social isolation is heightening vulnerability, for sexual assault occurring, as well as for survivors receiving services. But when I think about prevention, honestly, I sort of feel excited because I think it also provides us opportunities to really relook at and rethink and take some fresh views to our work, right? So avenues that I think have been emerging, we could take a greater focus on, looking at issues around digital consent, right? Now that people are in relationship virtually, even more so than they might have been before, teens and adults, I think, using those opportunities to really talk about digital consent and what does that look like for teens, what does that look like for adults, what does that look like in the workplace is really important, and it's even more important now. And so I think that presents some potential new opportunities or expanded opportunities to think about consent. And I think also, consent is sometimes can be a hard discussion to have or a tricky discussion to have, but I think there's some parallels have opened up right now that we're in this pandemic and we're talking about social distancing, we're talking about mask wearing, we're having to work with friends and families around negotiating boundaries. We're in the grocery store and saying, hey, could you back up, right? Like, so we have these sort of somewhat parallels that we can use as a jumping off point to talk about boundaries and consent. And then I think just really as at the community level, still so much of our prevention work is individual level work, right? Like we might be working in middle schools to change attitudes and beliefs. That's still so much a part of it. And as those avenues are look different or are cut off, I think that allows programs to really step into that space and rethink a more expansive vision of what sexual violence prevention looks like in their community, and how can they move maybe more messaging into the virtual realm, and how do they explore some of these things that maybe they didn't have the bandwidth or the space because they were sort of continuing down this track that they had been going down for quite some time. But I think it, as many of us personally have taken had the opportunity to sort of take a different look at how we're living our lives, and maybe we want to slow down, or maybe we want to do things differently. I think that, we potentially have that opportunity as we think about prevention, and that's a little bit more of my bailiwick. So I talk about that more, how prevention looks, what that looks like in communities and with communities. And I know there's a lot of programs out there that have really stepped up to think about how do we innovate that, and so they've used things like mask making events to talk about messaging and safety at home and things like that. So I think it also, while it increases vulnerability, I think it also increases opportunity. And so I guess those are my thoughts around the current state in COVID and kind of where we're at. And Melissa, I will turn it back to you.
Thanks, Karen. I love the positive twist on that one. Renee, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm in such great company. I'm actually in awe of all the experience and happy to be here. So I as well have worked a variety of roles, starting with nonprofit 25 years ago at a rape crisis center in the state of Rhode Island. Was one of the first victim advocates at a police department in the state of Rhode Island years ago, and then moved forward with my career, and very thankful to have had the opportunity to work with the Department of Defense for over 15 years with their SAPR program when it first started, and watch it grow and morph into all the hard work they've done over the last 15 years. And thankful that they have folks like Dr. Dunlap and Karen to think about the prevention aspects. We were very response focused 15 years ago, obviously, just really trying to take care of folks. And it's good to see that shift. When I left the DoD world, I've taken on this new role just over a year ago at the Peace Corps, which is a very different culture, and many similarities. Obviously, we have folks all over the world in different locations. We're not, confined to a base, though. We're in these remote locations, literally immersed in the communities. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, I only had that exposure for a few months before we had to actually evacuate about 7,000 of our all 7,000 of our volunteers from 60 plus countries around the world. So I was only on board a couple of months to really see how our program assists our volunteers. And I think our population is a little different than, from the sense of the military kept going. College campuses, even though they went remote, we're still engaged with students. Once our volunteers came back stateside, there was only a short window of time that we were still actively engaged with them. And once their status changed and they returned to their home states, we really don't have a population that we're serving right now, other than really taking a deep dive, looking at ways to improve our program and services. And you'll hear me say or refer to risk mitigation or risk reduction versus prevention. One of the key differences, again, coming from the DoD world or local community victim advocacy, is that the populations that our volunteers are immersed in, we have no control over those outside impacts. They're immersed in this community, very different culturally, very different remotely. Access to peers and resources is very different. So we work a lot with volunteers when they come on board about understanding the cultural differences, the meaning of the terminology we all use regularly, but what does sexual assault, sexual harassment, street harassment, unwanted attention, all those types of things to help build their resiliency and understanding of how they can reduce their risk in these environments. Of course, on the flip side, we have security folks that do assessments of the area and from a physical security standpoint, ensure they're safe. We certainly don't want to send folks to these remote locations into unsafe environments, but they're coming into contact with folks that aren't exposed to these conversations the way we are now, thankfully, here in the United States. And I'm very thankful that we are having these type of panels and these open discussions, but there's still so much out there that's misunderstood. And I did find when you bring volunteers in from all over the country for what we call pre-service training, their perspectives and knowledge of what constitutes sexual assault, what is prevention, what is normal behavior, considered consent, and consensual activities, that varies too. So trying to take this cohort and educate them before we send them off to a third world country where it's even more different. So we've really used this time to dive into research and ways that we can improve our risk mitigation techniques. So back to you.
Thanks, Renee, so much for that. Ms. Londigan, would you like to go next and tell us about how COVID has really impacted military sexual assault prevention?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for putting this panel together. Again, just echo the comments that, with everybody here, I think it's going to be a really good conversation going forward because we all have a little bit of different experience that really brought us into this field of prevention of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct across the United States and beyond. Again, Jill Londigan, I am the director for the Army SHARP which is the sexual harassment and assault response and prevention program. I've spent about the last 22 years within the Department of the Army. As said in my bio, I started out as a combat engineer, or started out in a combat engineer battalion as a medic, and then deployed and then spent time working on my graduate degree, mostly working with victims of military sexual trauma. And then was the director of substance abuse as well as suicide prevention, which plays an important role in the prevention of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And then recently was put into the position to be the director for the Army's SHARP program. I was really brought in based on my experience with transforming substance abuse treatment within the Army. It was previously seen as criminal in nature instead of really seeing it as a behavioral health condition, just like any other behavioral health condition that needs treatment within our formations. As far as COVID goes, again, we obviously in the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, we don't get a day off just because of COVID. We still have to continue to come to work. As you can tell, we have missions not only stateside, but abroad as well whenever COVID happened. But it did really affect us in really a lot of our prevention outreach engagements. It really reinforced the need for us to sustain a really active webinar program. We have monthly webinars to sustain the SHARP professionals' awareness of current prevention, as well as response theories, as well as practices. When it comes to our sexual assault response coordinators and our victim advocates that are located within our brigades, within the Army, as well as on our various different military installations. Even throughout the pandemic, we have been able to still provide really that face-to-face advocacy and response. It goes back to what was being said earlier. We really didn't want to make that a virtual platform because, again, when you're telling your story, especially as detailed as we have to get, since we also hold, prosecution of the person, there's things that come in needs to be aware of. There's a lot of information that we have to gather, especially at the very beginning. And we really didn't want that to happen in a virtual space. So our sexual response coordinators, victim advocates, again, still provided really that face-to-face advocacy and response. Again, still while maintaining social distance in accordance with CDC guidelines. A lot of the other support services, behavioral health is just one example. They were able to do virtual appointments for people that need it, but then again, people who really wanted that face-to-face interaction, they were still able to make that happen within the Department of the Army. So again, look forward to the discussion, and then I'll pass it back over to you guys. Thanks.
Hey, that's awesome. I really do appreciate all four panelists and their opening comments. So I thought I would just kind of jump right in. When I looked in the attendance box here, and you can see a really good cross section is joining us here for this call today. We've got people out of government, looks like many organizations coming out of the schoolhouse. So I thought I would start with a little bit what General Austin, that new Secretary of Defense, started off and talking about the role of leadership, and maybe get the panelist's opinion kind of on that, not just specifically through the Department of Defense, where General Austin clearly is in charge, but broader within your organizations, and maybe specifically talk about it in the role of the leader, setting that environment from a role of both prevention, as you see that, we talked a little bit about that, the panelists did, and then from support for the individual. Because if you think about that continuation of harm, stopping sexual assault, really, you have to move that conversation left. And so what I'd like to do is kind of maybe start with Jill Dunlap here in a second, but to give you a quick heads up, I'd love to hear from all the panelists. So Jill Dunlap, please.
Sure, and you're talking about the role of leadership in addressing these topics.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Kind of the role of the leader, whether it's, like I said, in your organization as you see it, not just the sexual assault, your roles as leaders in the field, subject matter experts, but how you would coach or counsel the head of your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think we are hopeful with some changes I think that will probably be coming, and you think about national leadership, right? That we may get some really strong signals, especially for campuses, around how they should be supporting and investigating sexual harm that happens on campus. So I think, when we think leadership, we think, pretty largely and what changes will come at the federal level. I think at the campus level, a lot of really important messaging can come from the president of the institution. And I think the way that we saw that play out most recently was, again, and like you'll get tired of me saying Title IX, but when the new Title IX regulations came out, really what we heard from campus presidents was messages saying, hey, look, we get that the federal government is going in a different direction, and they say that we can't investigate off-campus sexual assault, right? But what we do want to assure students is that we will address off-campus sexual harm through our student conduct process. And so there was a lot of messaging that came from presidents of institutions that said, while we understand that there is a rollback of regulations at the federal level, that we as an institution are committed to investigating and adjudicating harm that happens to our students, whether it's sexual violence, dating and domestic violence, or stalking. And so I think that that has been really important. I think the other way that we, as an association, try to work with leaders is that we work with cohorts through our Culture of Respect program, and it's cohorts of institutions that sort of work together to say, okay, what is leadership saying on this topic, and how do we get their attention? But when you bring campuses together, they can talk about what's working best at their institution, and then others can learn from that sort of cohort model. So I would say a lot of our prevention focus comes through our Culture of Respect program. And that really is engaging leaders in the ongoing efforts that are happening on the ground. Because I think when you're running an institution, you have a lot of things coming at you, right? Like you're working on vaccinations and testing and all of those things that are COVID related right now. But it doesn't mean that this is falling off the radar. And so I think to the extent that you can form cross-functional teams and that they engage the leadership regularly about what's happening on the prevention front and what's happening on the response front, that the leadership is then aware of what's happening, but then the leadership can also be involved in messaging. And I think that goes to not only students who are impacted, but also sending a strong message to faculty and staff, as well as the parents of students and alumni, and saying, look, this is going to continue to be an ongoing issue for us. And I would say, at the student level, that's a very important message. They hear that loud and clear when they get a message from the president. They're opening that email, right? Like they may ignore mine as a faculty member, but when the president sends an email, they're opening it. And I think it sends a really strong signal, not only to that campus community, but to higher education in general, and sort of clues other leaders in that, like, hey, we should be messaging to our students as well, that this is an important issue. And we will continue to support our students regardless of sort of what happens at the federal regulatory level. So I think leadership is absolutely essential on the college campus with regard to this topic.
No, I think that's awesome. And really for the other panelists, what we really like to do is just jump right in. I'm not going to kind of call you out on that topic, but please.
Yeah, so this is Jill. So I'll talk about the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, just a little bit about how we see, just like General Austin said, this is retired General Austin, of really how he sees that this is a leadership issue. And I think that's one of the things we're really trying to focus on. I think sometimes at our level, we really get stuck into looking at, from a programmatic standpoint, what do your policies say? What are your programs doing? And even though those are what we feel are fundamentally sound, though we're not saying we don't need to update them. We're actually going through a transformation right now when it comes to some programmatic stuff. People are focused just on that, when we know that programs and policies are not what changes culture. We obviously have a trust issue within the military. A lot of the soldiers, again, don't trust their leadership, and the only way to build trust is to have a relationship. And so I think those are the things that, leaders really need to start to focus on. The Sergeant Major of the Army came out with TIMS. It stands for This Is My Squad. And it's an effort that's really led by the Sergeant Major of the Army to really build cohesive teams at echelon, with priority, obviously, with the squad. This TIMS concept is really intended to build a climate of dignity and respect at all levels, in which behavior incompatible with the Army values is not accepted. So that's just one thing of many things that our leaders are doing. We've really changed a lot of our command leadership courses to include additional information on trying to prevent sexual harassment and sexual assault within our programs. We have monthly, what we call sexual assault review boards where we not only look at specific cases and timelines, but we also look at other various leadership metrics to ensure that we're holding leaders accountable for the things they're supposed to be doing within their formation, especially when it comes to the prevention and response aspects of sexual harassment and sexual assault within our formations.
Very similar with Peace Corps. Obviously, the director, it's very important. Start switching out our due to the change in administration where we have an acting director, but I'm confident that it will still be equally important, the messaging, like you said, from the top. And it's not just lip service. They genuinely get involved. They are part of the discussions. We have country directors at each post, which I had to wrap my head around our structure when I transitioned, and I kind of equate to a commander in each country. And that country director actually has a quarterly meeting with the designated staff that respond to sexual assaults in country. So for the volunteers, and it includes a medical officer, safety and security manager, what we call a SARL, which would be similar to your SARC, but we sexual assault response liaisons. But they have these quarterly discussions. So regardless of, 5 cases or hopefully not, but 25 cases, they're still coming together. It's a level of importance, and the messaging that goes out is that, they will do whatever necessary to support that volunteer to ensure their continuation of service as they see fit. Of course, if the volunteer wants to return stateside, that's their choice, but the optimal, outcome is to provide the support services in response. Obviously, we'd prefer not to have them at all, but that leadership involvement and engagement. We have such a smaller organization. For me, it's also very different because they do know all their folks. They know all their volunteers that are in the field, which I think commanders or coming from the military side, there's an intent to, but the higher up you go, there's less, it's just not as possible to know everyone. So I do see that as a positive. They have very, very close engagement with the volunteers. And again, volunteers know that the leadership wants to keep them safe and support them if anything does happen to them.
I think I would sort of expand out our concept of leadership a little bit. So definitely Jill and Renee spoke to organizational leadership really powerfully, right? And how that sets the tone for both what happens within an organization or department and how things are handled. From more of like a community perspective, I also think about who are the community leaders and how do they set tone for that community, right? So I have a colleague who works with migrant farm workers. And so one of the things that she does is who is the informal leadership within that community that may be helpful in messaging, setting a different idea, talking about rights and responsibilities and safety and consent and things like that. And so how do we engage in community with community leaders, both formal and informal, to really move forward ideas of safe, equitable relationships, or sort of whatever is the pertinent messaging for that particular community is also a really powerful place to both expand prevention efforts as well as think about how do we support survivors in community. So just kind of bringing a little bit more nuance to the leadership conversation and expanding out our ideas of leadership and what that looks like and who that is.
And I'm glad you actually mentioned that, Karen, because we've recently started including what we call country counterparts in training as well. So the principal at the local school that the volunteer will be working at, or certainly the host families that they live with, that they are all also engaged and educated on consent and appropriate norms and how to assist each other if there are red flags or something concerning that happens as well. So the community aspect is huge.
That's awesome, Renee. That sounds really powerful. That sounds like a great direction.
In terms of, as we're talking about leadership, I think we talk a lot about leadership in terms of response, specifically around prevention, because prevention is hard to talk about because it's hard to get leadership buy-in in the sense that we can show rates of sexual assaults increasing or decreasing. Prevention sometimes is more difficult to get buy-in for and leadership buy-in for and resources. So what are some of the things that you've seen done or that you have done in your own organization that have kind of helped to build that leadership buy-in around prevention specifically, and that could maybe be scaled to different organizations? Maybe Karen, I'll start with you just because I know that you have worked so much within the prevention field, especially around primary prevention. And you might want to also explain the difference between primary prevention, if you would give some background.
Sorry about my dog. The hazards of virtual work. So yeah, thank you, Melissa. So primary prevention, for folks who don't know, public health looks at primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. And primary prevention be looking at how do we stop sexual assault or sexual violence or anything on the continuum of harm, right, from occurring in the first place. So rather than trying to reduce risk necessarily or respond, but really how do we change policies, environments, norms, beliefs, values to prevent it from initially occurring. And I think back in a way to when we first started this work at CDC, that was in 2001. And there was a lot of pushback from the sexual violence field from that. There were a lot of concerns that doing prevention meant that we weren't really going to focus on response, or that the focus on response would be diminished, right? And that's a huge concern. That's a value concern. And there may be organizational leaders that have that concern as well, right? Like if we start to expand our focus over here, what happens here? And so it was really about building relationships, coming up with win-wins. Everybody in the field wants to prevent it from initially occurring. Of course, there was some skepticism that you could actually do that as well. A healthy dose of skepticism as well. But I think it's just about building relationships and really making a commitment that if you do prevention, it doesn't mean you're not going to do response, right? Like that need is still there. That need still needs to be met, but we're never going to response our way out of the problem. And so if we truly have a commitment to supporting women, children, if we truly have a commitment for a violence-free community or a violence-free society, then we really have to take up the charge of prevention. And so I think it's just really finding places of alignment, places of mutual values, mutual goals, and building from there. So it's a little bit of a general answer than this argument really won over this leader, but I don't know if there is just a one size fits all, right? It's really about engaging that relationship, seeing what people's concerns are, what people's hopes and values are, and how do you meet that and bring that all together. And I think that's really that's what we did when we were engaging with our state sexual assault coalitions and local rape crisis centers and public health departments early on in this, sort of expansion out to primary prevention to really bring everybody in as partners in this, as opposed to this sort of it's this or this piece.
Yeah, so this is Jill from the Army. I agree with everything that's been said. I think specifically for our organization, we've really been focused on getting leader buy-in by ensuring that, one, that we add additional training to our pre-command courses, our first sergeant courses, so certain leadership courses, starting all the way down with junior leaders. We've implemented a new SHARP elite trainer for command teams to take, and it's based scenario based, a real life scenario based, and how they respond to each one of those things obviously takes them in a certain direction. And then at the very end of it, they do an AAR to really show them what they could have done better in each one of the different scenarios that they were presented. And some things we're really trying to do to, again, to get leader buy-in. The other thing that we've really done at the junior leader level, again, with besides, this is my squad, which is really starting at the squad level, is really trying to change the training that we've been provided previously in the Department of Defense. We're very known for doing, death by PowerPoint presentations for training in an audience of 500 people. And we really revamped our SHARP training support packet to really focus on, again, small leader-led small group discussions that really need to happen in order to facilitate this conversation and really work at that levels to start to change culture within our organization. So again, those are just some of the things that we're definitely working on as part of our transformation to really try to get leadership buy-in. The other thing that we're trying to work through in the transformation is really prevention. Obviously, we all want to get to the left of the issue. Like you said, we're never going to, with the response that we have in the rates that we have, we're not going to get ourselves out of the job of being response. But how do we get to the left of the issue? And then really, who is responsible for that? Is that us responsible for it at the programmatic level, or really the prevention of problematic behaviors within our formation should really be a leadership issue? But then since the prevention field, it is fairly new in the fact of how do you hold leaders accountable with metrics to say they aren't getting after the problem is always an issue, because you say, okay, more reporting means they have more confidence in the program. Well, is that true? Or does that mean that, again, more is happening on the ground and not necessarily the case? So that's really where we find ourselves kind of in a tough place to figure out if prevention of all problematic behaviors is really on our leadership level at the lowest ground. What are metrics that we should be using to hold them accountable to ensure they do their job, because they're in charge of the health and welfare of their soldiers? And again, that's not something that's necessarily going to be solved with a memo or a policy or, a particular type of program to really get after, what leaders need to be doing in this area.
I think from a campus perspective, I think one of the pitfalls of being driven by federal regulations is that our focus ends up being on response, right? And some of that, like, we do have things that we have to do in terms of prevention programming in higher education, that are required in the Clery Act. Again, you hear me say required. I think campuses are sometimes loath to do things unless the government's telling them that they have to do that, right? But the compliance focus, I think, skews us sort of in the direction of, thinking about Title IX and thinking about response. And so I think sometimes the prevention side of things doesn't get as much shine in the higher ed community. And it makes sense, I guess, if you're thinking about it from a skeptical point of view, like, are you going to get sued by someone because you didn't do prevention programming? No. Are you going to get sued by somebody because they were removed from your institution after being found responsible for sexual assault? Very likely, right? And so it's sometimes, I think, driven by, where risk management tells you to focus your attention. But I think the other trouble that I see, and one of the things I think is so brilliant about this conversation today, is that higher education doesn't often look outside of its own silo, right? And so we don't see, I think, a lot of campuses, they'll hire a Title IX coordinator, and that Title IX coordinator will come in and say, we're going to do prevention and it's going to be so great. And then in the meantime, you have people on campus who've been doing prevention since the 70s as part of like women's centers, right? And they're like, cool, we've been doing that for a really long time. Or you have community agency partners, right, that are using really good data from the CDC, and they're like, this is like our full-time job. So it's cool that the institution wants to do that, but I think they very rarely sort of rely on the expertise that we find in, agencies like the CDC and the ERPi programs, or in community organizations that are like literally adjacent to their campuses often. Or the military, like, what is the military doing really, really well that campuses can learn from? And so I think these sort of cross pollination conversations don't happen really frequently, because institutions think, we're the academics, we're the brightest minds, and we're going to solve this and do it. And, also be in compliance with the federal government, but that the more like holistic approach to prevention and sort of relying on the people that we know are, have been doing this for a really long time and have data behind how to do it well, is sometimes, I think, where we fall down on the job a little bit.
And I think what also makes prevention so obscure or difficult to kind of rationalize is how do you measure it? You know, you can measure what you're doing, whether it's classes or training or, you know, some form of survey feedback mechanism or outreach, but did you prevent something? How do you measure that? And I think that's one of the challenges we have faced, even with when I was on the military side, but definitely on the Peace Corps side. We were actually just talking about our monitoring and evaluation logic model. And, you know, yes, if we have all this criteria of how to assist a volunteer when they've disclosed a sexual assault, you know, we can concretely show where we have met those objectives. But how do we show how we've reduced this risk or prevented an assault? You know, it's just how do you measure that, and how do you have that something tangible for people to see and talk about? And I don't have the answer.
Yeah, this is Joe, and I agree with you. I think that's the thing that we really struggle with, because again, when congressional leaders and other people see, okay, we're giving you X millions of dollars to really get after this problem, and then they don't see a change in the numbers, then they want to know, well, what are we giving you all this money for? What are you preventing? And again, it's very hard to figure out. Like you said, I can't necessarily say that just because I implemented this part of the program or something new that I necessarily prevented, you know, misconduct from happening, or, you know, assault from happening, because again, you're trying to predict human behavior that obviously is not always predictable. It's the same issue that we face in suicide prevention, is we're doing all these things, you know, to get after the CDC says these are the risk factors. We're making sure that we have something aligned to each one of those risk factors. But again, we're talking about human behavior that's not predictable. And I can't say, even if I bubble wrapped everybody, I can't say whether or not this person's going to commit suicide or not. And it's just, like you said, a tough thing to really wrap our hands around, of how do you necessarily say, you know, you decreased anything. When I was the director for substance use disorder care before this job, I implemented voluntary care where soldiers could come get help for alcohol related problems before the problems resulted in alcohol misconduct. And again, that was even though I decreased deployment ineligibility by 57% just by implementing, because more people came forward before the event happened, the way unfortunately some leaders looked at the issue was, well, we still have the same rate of alcohol misconduct. You didn't make that go anywhere. And again, that wasn't what I was trying to do. What I was trying to do is to give an avenue for people to come in and get help before it impacted their career. Because previously, the way the program was structured, that wasn't allowed. Whether it was, you know, before you had an incident, after an incident, everybody was enrolled in the same program. And we wanted to, again, make it more like behavioral health, where it was really early intervention, where people could come in, again, before they've had an incident happen. But again, I can't say whether or not we could have, you know, prevented any type of behavior within our organization.
Yeah, I think those are really great examples that you gave, though, Jill, right? Around being clear about what are we interested in moving the needle on? What are we actually measuring? And risk and protective factors, right, being important correlates that we need to be measuring. And then really having to educate people on that, on your logic model, and you know, on your evaluation measures, and what you're changing, and you know, what your theory of change is. And no, it's not as neat in a bow as response, for sure. But I think if we, you know, can engage people in developing those theories of change together, and really getting that buy-in for where we're going, then that can be kind of helpful in our long-term approach. But I think you gave some really great examples. I love the piece that you talked about of, you know, telling your commander, right? Like, well, that wasn't what I was trying to do. This is what I was trying to do. And this is the impact that what I was doing is going to have, or has had, which is really powerful, I think.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. And I think the other thing that is tough for us, especially in the military, and what we've seen in our various different prevalence data and surveys that we do, is really the lack of accountability. And so again, it's very hard to prevent any type of problematic behavior when you don't see people being held accountable for their behavior. So again, if I join the Army and said, hey, in order to join the Army, I'm not allowed to do drugs, and then I see someone within my formation that has had 4 or 5 positive UAs and they're still within the formation because the commander is not holding them accountable, then everybody else is going to get the idea that they can do it too. And I think, again, not saying that everyone's just going to sexually harass or sexually assault somebody, but again, when you look at the actual accountability within the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, it's fairly low. And when we look at survey reports, when we ask people why they didn't come forward, because we have about a 76% underreporting. So obviously underreported crime within the United States, but within the Army specifically. And when you really ask them why they haven't come forward, they really felt that nothing was going to be done. And unfortunately, when you look at some of the stats, when it does come to sexual assault accountability, more times than not, nothing is done. So again, I think that's another thing that plays into the fact of, again, how do you really prevent something from happening, especially when you see other people doing it and unfortunately getting away with this behavior.
Yeah, that's a really good conversation. I kind of want to stay with it for a second and maybe just add to, it sounds like the feedback mechanism, right? If you're going to evaluate or measure the program's success, you need some feedback on what you do, almost to make it work as some direct feedback. I would be interested your thoughts around barriers to communication. I mean, we talk about that a lot. I know my time in the DoD was there were the barriers why victims of sexual assault wouldn't come forward. But I'm wondering if you could even maybe expand that. And Rainey, I'll come to you first, is that from your perspective, how can barriers help, not only from the reporting from a victim or a survivor, how is it from the organization writ large, back to if they're not being held accountable? I mean, how do you get that sense of where your organization is broadly, right? So the leader, again, has an opportunity to know where to go. I'm interested how your thoughts on that, Renee.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for putting me on the spot now. I haven't had, again, with the Peace Corps side, we do have a lot of similarities with regard to the underreporting that you see, I think, in society in general, of course, but then what I had seen with the military side. And we have various types of surveys to try to get to the root of why someone does not want to report. And institutionally, for us, one of the key things is they've given up their life for these 2 years to commit to this project. And if the common theme I see is that if they report, either they're going to be removed and brought back, which is not the case. It's definitely not an automatic, but that is a perception. So I think we work really hard at trying to mitigate those false perceptions, try to break down that barrier, that they will be part of their decision-making process of what happens, as long as they're safe and healthy to continue with their service. And I'm sorry, I just trying to think of, it's just, let me gather my thoughts. I apologize.
No, that's good. Jill Dunlap, I mean, again, from your perspective, when you think about reporting in an academic, what are some of the barriers? And I ask that not to identify what we all know, but really ways to think about reducing them, right, and getting past them. How do we get more communication moving back up into the program to help us do micro-targeting of effectiveness to see what's working and get that level of feedback? Kind of some thoughts there, please.
Yeah, I think, it's going to be, I think, a lot of me echoing what other folks have said. And I think that's partly accountability. I think one of the things that campuses, again, overlap really strongly with in terms of the military, at the data shows, is that reasons survivors don't come forward to report is institutional betrayal, right? So like in the campus environment, like we want you to be a part of this community, and you're one of us, you're a Husky or a Mustang or whatever the mascot is, right? Until something bad happens, and then you're sort of found on an island unto yourself, and it's like you have the possibility of losing your social circle and all of those things. And so I think the feedback loop that you're talking about is one that we really struggle with, because there are a lot of really well-resourced campus violence prevention and response centers. And, I led a staff of 6 when I was at my most recent institution, 6 full-time people that were doing both prevention and response. But, we were really sort of hesitant to survey or, get feedback from survivors who had come forward about how did you, overcome those barriers, because we didn't want to, place an additional burden on them. So I think I don't have an easy answer for how you get that feedback loop. I think one of the sort of more remote ways that we were doing that is like, how were students finding us? And a lot of the data supported that, because we had done a very specific training program with peers. Again, the research shows that students will, disclose to peers first and foremost, and then if they have a positive experience and that peer knows how to get that survivor to a resource, that they're much more likely to experience less trauma, in the long term, and they're having, have a quicker, like sort of not healing time, but they get access to resources more quickly. And so what we started doing was training their peers on how to respond, because we knew that's where survivors would go first. And so then we would see an increase in the number of students who said, my friend went through your training program, and when I told her what happened to me, she told me I needed to come here. And so that was sort of a feedback loop of like, well, at least we know where they're reporting, and we know what's sort of easing the transition from I've been harmed and I'm not going to go talk to a stranger in an administrative office just because that's what they tell me I should do. But I'm going to tell my roommate, I'm going to tell my RA, and that person had a very positive experience where they believed me and they got me resourced to the place where I could, the structural place that could give me the support that I needed. So I think we struggle a lot with that feedback loop in at least in the campus environment.
Hey, Jill, this is Jill. So just a little bit of feedback is, I think what's helped us so much is by doing workplace gender relations surveys to really look at some of that information, because what we know at the last one that it was done in 2018, it's done every 2 years, but because of COVID, it's going to be done off cycle in 2020. But what we do know is about 66% of people who report do experience retaliation. And most of the time that retaliation comes within their own chain of command. So what we've been able to also add to our reporting is anytime a specific form in a specific database, and we take that information to higher leadership, because we do ask throughout the process if now, because of that information, if people now are experiencing retaliation, and then we have a specific form they fill out when that happens, so we can again go to higher leadership to say this person is experienced retaliation because of their report of sexual assault within their formations. I think the other thing that it's told us too is that we know of the people who reported, about 40% of women and about 25% of men said that they wouldn't report again. And while that's a very generalized question, it now allows me to do some more pinpoint surveys within the Department of the Army specifically to say, what is it about reporting that you say you would never do it again? Is it the way you were treated by the special victim prosecutor? Is it how you were treated by your chain of command? Was it the lack of behavioral health services? Because again, that's so broad of a question. I don't know where to target my efforts. So by doing an additional study within the Army to say, what is it about, again, the reporting of why you wouldn't do it again because the perpetrator wasn't held accountable, because then that allows me to take more information to senior leaders to say, again, the majority of people said they wouldn't report again because perpetrators aren't held accountable. So no matter what shiny special stuff I do on the programmatic side, nothing's going to get after this until you do something about accountability within our formations and get after the culture and really get after the other things that play into the culture. Gender inequality is obviously an issue that we have, gender discrimination within our organization. So happy to share offline some of that stuff with you that we look at. Obviously our survey is very lengthy that we do, but again, maybe thinking about the future, because then in a resource constrained environment, it sometimes allows us to tailor our resources based on the feedback from people to say, this is why I wouldn't do it again. Let's just say, for example, your victim advocates, weren't really strong in customer service. They didn't seem to really listen to me when I talk. Then you obviously know, okay, I need to do some retraining in that area and focus my efforts on that, because then more people will come forward, because it's about Jill Londigan telling Jill Dunlap that, again, I went and saw these people. They really helped me out. You should really go see them too if that happened to you. And that's really how we're going to change it, internally on our campuses, obviously within the culture of the military.
And I was just thinking, how do you balance that with what we used to call the smoke pit conversations, or the negative? I think there's been lots of positive peer-to-peer in our organization as well, to support and say, hey, this bad thing happened to me. If you talk to so-and-so, they can really help point you in the right direction or get you what you need. And that's great. But then if you go on Reddit or some of these social media sites, there's so much negativity. And it's no different than 20 years ago when I would teach a class and start talking about, you're mentioning accountability. If you start talking about this topic in general, inevitably someone in that class, would say, oh yeah, well, my friend was falsely accused, or, I have a friend who didn't get any help, or nothing happened when they reported, or any of those things. And that, that breeds in the underground too, and is a huge barrier. I think that's definitely one of ours, is the social media connections, where it takes an incident potentially out of context. It could be factual. There could have been a negative incident, of course, but certainly takes something and it just kind of breeds and grows and morphs into this negative culture about reporting or the assistance that they can get.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I struggle with right now, because unfortunately within the Department of the Army, especially the sexual harassment and sexual assault program has unfortunately been intertwined to me inappropriately with the legal as well as the legal aspects and the investigative aspects of what we're trying to do to prevent and respond to sexual harassment and sexual assault within our organization. So as I could read it on Reddit, I can read it on any social media platform, and people will say, again, the program's broken, or the program doesn't hold people accountable, because unfortunately they associate the program with the legal and the investigative aspects of it instead of really what we're trying to do. When I compare it to, and this is one of the things we have to provide a response to the new SecDef about some of the challenges that we had. And one of the things that I said is, when you look at the Army substance abuse program, there's still an investigative aspect of it. There's still a legal aspect of it, yet nobody associates the program of substance abuse with those two portions of it. But with our program, unfortunately, like I said, it's completely inappropriately intertwined of really what we're trying to do on response and how we're really trying to support commanders on prevention. I think that goes to the other issue is, again, we're trying to ensure that the people that are in charge of soldiers are appropriately being held accountable for preventing the things within their formations compared to the program itself. And I think that's the hard part is, again, it breeds a lot of misinformation about what the program's intended to do and what it's not supposed to do. If you look at, obviously, the Fort Hood Independent Committee report that was made public, the number one finding there was that what commanders weren't executing the program in the way that it's directed. And that's the thing that we struggle with, is we can have a perfect program, up at our level, but once again, it starts to trickle down to leaders and they put their own spin on it, decide to have their own metrics and do their own thing. Again, that's when the execution of the program fails. And again, how do you hold leaders properly accountable to ensure that they're executing it, across the board without having, a 50-man inspection team going, down to every single military base, checking to ensure that people are doing the right thing. And, it's definitely, a tough thing that we struggle with as well. So appreciate that.
I want to ask a quick question, because we're talking about accountability, which I think can go across the realm of leadership accountability, but also offender accountability. So it's kind of brought up by the fact that we've seen over the last few years with the Me Too movement, specifically around people who are famous and who have been accused of things, and some of it rape, some of it, groping or other inappropriate behavior. So as we're talking about the continuum of harm, and as we talk about not just sexual assault, meaning rape, but sexual harassment as well, how do we hold offenders accountable? Because if we're looking at this as, yes, a legal issue, but also what happens if you're speaking somewhere or you're out in public and something happens and you're harassed in a way? How do we hold those offenders accountable? And I know that it kind of varies amongst our panelists here, because obviously military and Renee, you as well, may have more ability, especially if they're within the Peace Corps, to have some accountability versus out in the public or on college campuses, especially if they're not a student at that college campus. But how does that work in going across that continuum of what sexual assault and sexual harassment looks like, to make sure that we are holding individuals accountable for their behavior?
It's actually interesting that you say that. in the sense that, so for our volunteers, if we have a volunteer on volunteer assault, of course, local jurisdiction, if an assault occurs in another country, the laws of that country, will guide and direct from a criminal response standpoint if a criminal response is warranted, as you're speaking to the level of, harassment to assault. But as volunteers, their status, we actually have limited options with the exception of administrative actions. And that's actually, so they of course can be removed from service, and they lose some of the benefits that go along with the completion of service with Peace Corps. But honestly, that's the level of accountability. If it's a volunteer on volunteer, again, if it's the local criminal laws come into play, and that varies significantly. But one of the challenges I saw at DLA with the Defense Logistics Agency with civilians, the accountability piece was huge because people wanted to know what happened. If I filed this report as a DoD civilian, what happened to that person? And then you pull into labor laws and equal employment opportunity situations and the confidentiality that goes along with personnel actions. So even if someone's not held criminally responsible, it's a real challenge to show on behalf of an organization as a federal employee that action has been taken other than just giving numbers. X amount of folks received administrative action, and they have to be very vague on that. And this seems to be across the board with many federal agencies that are trying to address sexual misconduct, at various levels that may not be meet the criminal element, but still address that, and people aren't necessarily able to see those outcomes. So that's a huge challenge.
I think we've done a lot of turning the corner in terms of thought on this in the higher education community, and some of that was again forced through federal legislation and that not legislation but regulation, and that there was a real emphasis in the previous administration under treating both parties in any sort of Title IX investigation equitably. And so there was a lot of language around campuses were railroading students' rights who were accused in favor of supporting survivors. And so, my organization and I, along with a couple of co-authors, looked and did a research study and did a landscape analysis of how campuses were working with respondents, is typically what they're called in Title IX investigations, so offenders. And one of the things that campuses have done really well is this will sound counterintuitive, especially for folks who only work with survivors, but I come from that background myself, but to really support respondents through that investigation system as well. Because I think typically when I started in this field, it was well, once you've identified them, make sure that you investigate them, find them responsible, and kick them off campus. Well, I'll tell you what, all that did was pass the problem, right? So a student would, get, expelled from one school and go re-enroll in another school. And if they were going to repeat offend, they would just offend at a different institution. And so I think what we've seen in recent years is a more holistic way of understanding offenders. And so providing, support systems to students who have been accused, who maybe are then found not responsible and remain on campus. And our sort of emphasis in doing that research was really to say that you have a lot of those instances where someone is accused, goes through the Title IX investigation process, was found not responsible, and remains on campus. Well, so what does that mean for the survivor who reported it? And so how do you support that person in thinking about risk reduction so that they aren't involved in, the high risk social environments where they might reoffend? How do we ensure that they aren't infringing on the feelings of safety of the survivor? And so we issued a report that I think Eliza has included in the resources section, but we are actually doing trainings now with campuses around how do you provide support services to someone who's been accused? Because again, it goes back to prevention. If we're just kicking them off campus and there's no education and there's nothing outside of the sanction that they might receive, then we've done them a disservice and we've done the community a disservice, or the next community that they become a part of. So how do we make sure that they're both held accountable, but also that, if they are going to remain part of our community, that they do so safely, and again, centering the survivor's safety in providing those supports to someone who's been accused. So it seems, like I said, counterintuitive, but really I think it does. What we found was that it ends up having better outcomes for survivors who then feel like, okay, this person is, like in the system, someone's aware of them, they're getting help, and all of those things. And I will say that, having sat across from a lot of survivors over the years on campus, a lot of times what they wanted was for that person to know what they did was wrong. They were never going to formally report. They did not want that person kicked off of campus. They wanted them to know that what they did was wrong. And so some of those pieces, I think campuses are doing a little bit better. And there's some really great organizations like the Campus Prism Project at University of San Diego that does really great restorative justice, even in cases of sexual violence that are survivor-centered, survivor-led, survivor-initiated, that have really great outcomes for survivors. So I think there's a variety of ways that we can look at offender accountability that may sort of rub against the grain of what we traditionally think of in terms of just like put them in jail or get them out of sight. And so I think higher ed is doing a really good job in that space.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Jill. I was hoping you would, the restorative justice piece. I was going to tee you up if you didn't, but I figured you would, because I think that's also what we see oftentimes too in smaller communities, right? Like when I was with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center in Alaska, and we were meeting with Inuit communities, right? Like they're, the law enforcement avenue wasn't even really existent. And that oftentimes really what they wanted was restorative justice and how to do that in a survivor-centered way. And to kind of expand, they didn't want to lose their person, right? And the survivor didn't necessarily want to lose their person to prison. And so I think, it's having that broader perspective around what does the survivor want, how does that work with the community, and really having a broader perspective and full range of option is great. And I'm glad to hear about the research coming out of college campuses and what the outcomes for survivors are with those avenues is great.
I have a question. Are you able to disclose what actions are or what services are provided so that survivor understands what those outcomes are? How does that work?
In the campus setting, I don't know if you were asking me, Renee, but
yes,
in the campus setting, we're really actually, when you were talking about people wanting to know the outcomes, we're really actually well protected because Title IX requires that the institution notify both the complainant and the respondent in an official investigation of the outcome of what happened, including like sanction, if there's ongoing accommodations that they can't have contact or, no contact orders, that sort of thing. So that's actually mandated for us. And so, and because it came from, a series of years and years of survivors being like, look, they told me he was sanctioned, whatever. And then I show up a year later and he's back on campus. So there was a lack of transparency around the accountability piece that I think that has been taken care of through federal regulation that I think is really, it serves survivors well because they are aware of what has happened.
Absolutely, because like you said, I think sometimes they just want to know what happened or what is happening, what's provided, not so much, and it's not always obvious, so.
Yeah, real quick, I know we're coming toward the end here in a second, but I thought I'd just maybe do a speed round. From all the panelists' perspective, as we think about 2021 going forward, what was something or a tool that would be helpful? We talked a lot about leaders' role and responsibility, both in setting conditions. We talked about their role in prevention, and we kind of tipped into a little bit through accountability. But now kind of, maybe from your perspective, we've got a lot of smart people that are on our call here just listening that might have ideas they can put in the chat, is what are some of the things that you would want, right? So maybe kind of go around real quickly, and I'll start with Karen. What are things that you would think you would need, right? I mean, what is you're thinking through solutions to either a prevention, a response, what are something that as you look forward would be helpful?
Oh boy, on the spot. Well, I don't know. You can take me out of I can take myself out of CDC, but I can't take CDC out of me, I guess, right? So more research, more research on effective primary prevention interventions in a variety of settings would be a big thing. Like we've come a long way. We actually have some evidence-based interventions now, but we need more in research on, what are more policy and environmental level changes that reduce rates of sexual violence. So that would be a big thing. Like, how can we support the field with evidence-based interventions that are actually actionable and scalable in community? I guess would be my top 2021 request.
I think that's good. And Renee, I'll hit you next, even though you'll probably get mad at me for calling you out again. But
no, I actually have to echo what she says, though, because I think we really need to rely on evidence-based practices, and that requires research. And then it kind of goes back to money and engagement at a very high level. And so ideally, I think if I could point to this is working in other organizations, multidisciplinary approaches like across organizations, and understanding what other folks are doing. That's been a huge benefit for me. So I just want to continue doing that in forums like this, as well as I'm on several working groups with other federal agencies, because we can't do it in isolation, because it's not an isolated to Peace Corps or military problem or college campus problem, clearly. So I think the crosstalk is just really, really important. So to continue those conversations.
That's awesome. And I'd hit Jill Dunlap next. I think part of this kind of drives back to what Joe Lundgren's been talking about, or is going to probably get the SecDef is having her do here, is ways to think about going forward. So Jill Dunlap, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what Renee said. And I think this kind of conversation is just absolutely essential to doing this work and doing it well and doing it effectively. I think, before COVID hit, there was a conference that was going to be on, I think, the overlap between campus and military sexual assault prevention and response that Eliza, Melissa, and I were going to go to, and then it got canceled because of COVID. But I was so excited for that conference. And I think as we think about funding and research, right, there's a lot of money being poured in by the federal government to different buckets that are represented here on how to do this work. And I think there is a lot of overlap. Jill talked about the gender surveys that they do, and we do campus violence surveys, but I think we could really focus in on what she was talking about and do more surveying of what survivors' experiences are rather than looking at prevalence rates, right? And so, learning lessons from one another and the good work that's happening and where that funding is going, and how do we share lessons learned across those areas. This kind of conversation is just absolutely essential to get to where we need to be.
No, I think that's really good. I kind of hit Jill Lundgren, your kind of thoughts here, and then I'll probably turn it over to Eliza right after that.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I agree with the panelist members. I think we've seen a lot of gaps really in prevention focused research coupled with really outdated and problematic prevalence data really within our organization. Like I said, we do depend on the workplace gender relations survey, but unfortunately that only accounts for about 13% of our population. So we really need more people responding to that survey so we can get a better idea of the estimated prevalence within our organization, because really it represents a major weakness really in our understanding of the environment, as well as our collective ability to really apply appropriate interventions. I think, based on obviously the Fort Hood Committee independent report, we obviously acknowledge that we do have more work to do, especially in the area of accountability, command climate, program execution, as well as prevention. But I think, to be completely honest, with everybody on the call, is that, the Army will continue to experience sexual harassment and sexual assault within our ranks unless we really address the widespread cultural challenges that really have the direct correlation within sexual misconduct. Really includes a culture of exclusions, which includes sexism, gender discrimination, gender inequality, and really a culture of impunity, which again, the lack of accountability for perpetrators as well as our leaderships. So really hoping in 2021 that we can really start to get more data specifically around this area, and we can do more to, again, hold leaders and perpetrators accountable for this behavior within our formations.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I appreciate everyone's thoughts on this. And I realize I'm going to kick it back over to Eliza, because I think we're coming almost, unfortunately, to the end of the time here. So Eliza, over to you, please.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you, Melissa. I'm just going to quickly share my screen and then we'll do a wrap up. There we go. Well, what a fantastic discussion. I learned an incredible amount, and I want to thank our panelists and a number of other people who have helped put this panel together. It was such a wonderful experience, so thank you. So first, thank you to our just wonderful, fantastic panelists, Jill Londigan, Renee Ferranti, Jill Dunlap, and Karen Lang for your time, expertise, and perspective today. Thank you also to Melissa Bartnick and Mike Hudson for facilitating such a meaningful discussion. I'd like to also thank some of my ERPi colleagues who helped put this panel together, including Jessica Ankel, Lindsay Busher, Suzanne Payne, Terry Chandler, Brittany McMaster, and Stacy Donald. Thank you to Dr. Keita Franklin, who helped seed the idea for this panel and who introduced us to some of our panelists. And finally, I'd like to thank our audience today. Your participation and support for this topic is greatly appreciated. We hope that today's discussion has sparked a conversation that you can take back to your community as we continue to make strides in preventing sexual assault. Before we adjourn and before I end the recording and close the Zoom, we want to acknowledge that sexual assault often goes undisclosed and unreported due to a number of barriers, several of which we talked about today. If you or someone you know is experiencing sexual violence, sexual assault, please call the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE or visit rain.org, and that is rain with 2 N's.org. And if you'd like to learn more about sexual assault prevention and response, please take a look at the additional resources that we've provided here, and we have put them in the chat box for you as well. Thank you all for joining. Spark a conversation. Have a wonderful afternoon.